February 23rd, 1942. Somewhere over the unmapped green hell of Papua, the world was fire and screaming metal. Then it was just the swamp. For the survivors of the downed B-17, the silence that followed was worse than the crash. 19-year-old Private First Class Samuel Armstrong, a gunner from Scranton, lay with a shattered femur listening. He could hear the jungle breathe, a thick, wet, suffocating sound. Worse, he could hear the patrols, the crisp Japanese commands of the South Seas Detachment, cutting through the mangroves. They were hunting, always hunting. The official briefing had been clear. Capture was not an option. But then other shapes emerged from the green. Silent figures. They carried no guns, wore no uniforms. They moved through the suffocating terrain as if born of it. Someone in the wreckage whispered they were headhunters. Someone else, delirious, said they were ghosts sent to ferry them to the afterlife. The after-action debriefings, classified Pacific Theater Eyes Only, were deliberately vague. The folder designated 734 Alpha contained hundreds of pages on logistics, casualties, and enemy movements. But on the subject of these mysterious saviors, it was almost mute. A footnote here, a redacted paragraph there. The reports called them native bearers, or in a condescending memo, the fuzzy-wuzzy angels. But this was not the whole story. It wasn't even the beginning. The official narrative was one of hired labor, of transactional assistance. The rumors told a different tale. Rumors smuggled back in the minds of wounded men. Rumors of being carried for weeks on crude stretchers, shielded by human bodies from Japanese patrols. Rumors of villagers starving themselves to feed American aviators. Rumors of a profound debt that was never acknowledged. A debt that was never paid. The records were designed to be silent, but the men who were carried were not. And in the villages that cling to the mountainsides along the Kokoda Track, the children of the carriers remember. This investigation uncovers the story they were never asked to tell. January 4th, 1943. General Headquarters, Southwest Pacific Area. Brisbane, Australia. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke and quiet desperation. They said the island was a myth, a place on the edge of the world where the maps stopped, where cartographers wrote, "Here be dragons," and meant it. New Guinea. It was the second largest island on the planet. A fact nobody in Kansas City or Liverpool knew, or cared about. But here in this room, it was everything. It was the only thing. The campaign had a name. The New Guinea-Papua campaign. It sounded clean. Official. A line in a history book. But it was a lie. It was not a campaign. It was a disease. A festering wound on the map that refused to heal. It began in early 1942. January, to be exact. The Japanese came south. Always south. They moved with a speed that defied logic, a green wave of men perfectly suited to the green hell they were conquering. They took Rabaul on January 23rd, then Leh, then Salamaua, a litany of fallen dominoes, of outposts swallowed by the tide. Rabaul, Kavieng, Gazmata, Finschhafen. The names were whispers of defeat carried on the humid air. The report stated the territories were overrun. A polite word, a terribly polite word for annihilation. Why here? Why fight for this primordial nightmare? The generals in Washington in their clean uniforms saw it on their globes. A barrier, a fortress, an unsinkable aircraft carrier anchored just north of Australia. If New Guinea fell, Australia was next. General Douglas MacArthur knew it. He saw the island not as a jungle, but as a dagger, pointed at the heart of his entire theater of operations, the southern flank of the Allied Pacific strategy. Lose it, and you lose everything. You lose the war. It was that simple. It was that brutal. So they sent the boys from Iowa, from Texas, from the suburbs of Sydney. They were trained for open fields, for desert warfare, not for this. The jungle was the true enemy. a 100-foot-high canopy that blocked the sun, creating a permanent, suffocating twilight. The ground was a viscous soup of mud, rotting vegetation, and unseen things that slithered. The air was thick enough to drink, filled with the drone of a billion insects. And the rain, it never stopped. A constant, warm, demoralizing downpour that turned trails into rivers of mud and foxholes into graves. An officer's report, filed in a folder labeled ComSoPac Medical 11A, listed the real enemies. Not just the Imperial Japanese Army, but malaria, dengue fever, scrub typhus, dysentery, jungle rot. A soldier could survive a firefight at Buna only to be killed by a mosquito bite a week later. They died in droves, quietly, without glory. The isolation was a weapon. A soldier, 20-year-old Private Jack Corrigan from Dubuque, got separated from his platoon near Sanananda. He was gone for 3 days. They found him delirious, his rifle lost, covered in leeches, whispering about the trees. The trees that watched him. Men went missing all the time. Wounded men crawling away from a firefight were simply consumed, swallowed whole by the green. The jungle did not take sides. It took everyone. And then the main thing started, the second phase. The first phase was a panicked defense, a desperate scramble to hold the line at Port Moresby, the Kokoda track. They called it a track. It was a vertical staircase of mud and roots over the Owen Stanley Mountains. But they held. Barely. Now it was time to push back, to clear them out. Clear. Another clean, sterile word. The directive came from High Command, GHQ Oplan 7043. Neutralize and eject all enemy forces from Papua, the New Guinea Mandate, and the Dutch colony in western New Guinea. A simple sentence to describe an impossible task. On a wall in that Brisbane room, a map told the official story. A massive topographical chart of the island. Thin red lines showed the farthest extent of the Japanese advance. Now, thick blue arrows began to creep forward, from Buna, from Gona, from Wau. But the map was a fraud. It showed neat lines, clear objectives, named towns. It didn't show the swamps that could swallow a tank. It didn't show the razor-backed mountain ridges where a single machine gun could hold off a battalion. The vast swaths of the map were just green, unexplored, uninhabited, or so they thought. The map was a general's dream. The island was an infantryman's nightmare. This new phase was a grind, a slow, methodical, bloody business of rooting out an enemy that was dug in, fanatical, and perfectly at home in the hellish terrain. It wasn't one battle, it was 1,000 tiny, vicious skirmishes fought for control of a creek bed, a jungle clearing, a single hut. They called it mopping up. Rumors from the front said otherwise. They whispered that the Japanese weren't just fighting, they were changing, adapting, becoming part of the jungle itself. The official communiques spoke of pockets of resistance. The men who survived called them nests. Nests of things that were no longer entirely human, waiting in the dark. The context of the campaign wasn't on the map. It wasn't in the strategic plans. The context was the fear. The context was the fever dreams of a wounded corporal bleeding out in the mud, convinced he heard his name being whispered from the vines above. The reports were filed. The battles were given names. But the truth of the New Guinea-Papua campaign was something else. It was hidden in the lost flight logs, in the last words of dying men, in the unmappable green heart of the island itself. And it was far stranger and far more terrifying than any general in Brisbane could ever imagine. July 21st, 1942, the coast near Buna, Papua. They were ghosts. Before they were angels, they were ghosts. Men who moved through the green twilight of the jungle, unseen, unheard. The Japanese Second World War arrived with the tide, a wave of steel and noise that shattered the primeval silence. The war had come to this island at the end of the world, a place the maps had forgotten. But the ghosts were there, and they were watching. They were not soldiers, they were villagers. Men from Isarava, Alola, Eora Creek, Templeton's Crossing. They wore loincloths. Their feet were bare, tough as leather from a lifetime of walking on razor-sharp stones and tangled roots. Their magnificent, frizzy hair, often bleached with lime or peroxide, gave them a name. Not their real names, a name whispered by a dying Australian private in a stinking, humid field hospital. A name that would become a legend. Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels. The war was being fought over a line on a map, a line called the Kokoda Track. It was not a track. It was a 96-kilometer ordeal of mud and root and rock that clawed its way through the Owen Stanley Range. A vertical nightmare. The Australians had a name for one section, the Golden Stairs. It was a joke, a black, bitter joke for men climbing thousands of rough-hewn steps in the suffocating heat. A staircase to hell. And now they were coming back down it, in retreat. The Japanese were coming, the Australians were falling back, and the wounded were everywhere. They lay in the mud. They leaned against the giant, moss-covered trees. They were dying, not just of bullets and shrapnel. They were dying of gangrene, of malaria, of dysentery, of sheer soul-crushing exhaustion. The army couldn't move them. The army was fighting for its own life. The wounded were being left behind, left to the jungle, left to the Japanese. And then the ghosts appeared. They came out of the forest without a sound. They carried stretchers, not army-issue stretchers, litters woven from bush poles and vines. Strong, supple, and light. They were small men, most of them, wiry and thin. But they lifted the big, pale, wounded Australians. Lifted men who weighed twice what they did. Lifted them with a gentleness that broke the soldiers' hearts. They settled the stretchers on their shoulders, and they began to walk. The work was unimaginable. Up the muddy slopes, down the treacherous inclines, across raging whitewater rivers. 2 Papuans to a stretcher, sometimes 4, 180 pounds of dead weight, plus a rifle, plus a pack. They walked for days, 10 days, 12 days. That was the time it took. 10 days to carry one wounded man from the front lines to the casualty clearing station at Ower's Corner. 10 days in a jungle that was actively trying to kill everyone in it. The rain never stopped. The mud was a constant sucking thief. The leeches were a plague, and they never complained. The soldiers' diaries, the scribbled, rain-soaked letters home, they all say the same thing. They were magnificent, one entry reads, simply magnificent. Then there was a man named Leslie Allen, an Australian. They called him Bull, a stretcher-bearer, 33 years old, from Ballarat, Victoria. During the battle for Mount Tombu, the American forces were pinned down, raked by Japanese machine gun fire. Men were screaming. Men were dying. Bull Allen was a non-combatant. He carried no weapon. He carried only a bag of bandages and a fierce, stubborn courage. He ran into the fire, alone. He heaved a wounded American onto his shoulders and carried him back to the aid post. Then he turned around and went back. He went back again, and again, and again. The records state he did it 12 times. 12 times he walked into a wall of bullets to pull dying men out of the dirt. The Americans gave him a Silver Star for it. A hero, a legend. But the official report, filed under Awards and Commendations, SWPA 43A17, tells only a fraction of the story. The truth is always in the margins, in the whispers. Bull Allen was the first link in a chain. For every man he dragged from the firing line, a team was waiting just behind the ridge. Patiently waiting. A team of Papuans. They took the wounded from his exhausted arms. They cleaned the wounds. They started the long, impossible journey back. Allen was the face of the rescue. But the system, the network, the very possibility of survival, that was Papuan. Utterly Papuan. They were his hands, his feet, his compass, his hope. They were more than just carriers. They were guides, To the Australians, the jungle was a solid green wall of chaos, an enemy. To the Papuans, it was home. It was a book they could read. They knew the secret paths. They knew which bird calls were real and which were Japanese signals. They could smell the enemy on the wind. The soldiers learned quickly. "Stick with the fuzzy wuzzy," the sergeants would bark. "Don't you dare leave his side. He knows." He always knew. Why? Why did they do it? The official pay was a pittance, a few shillings a day, a stick of tobacco, salt. The Japanese offered them more. They also offered them death. Any Papuan caught helping the Allies was executed. Still, they came. Thousands of them. They came from their villages and offered to help. Their real names were never recorded. Ipi, Ovia, Karu, Sopa. Ghosts. A wounded Australian, Sapper Bert Barros, was carried for weeks. He lay on his stretcher, delirious, watching the tangled canopy slide by. He survived. He wrote a poem about the men who carried him, those fuzzy, wuzzy angels. The name stuck. It was a good story, a comforting myth. But the most famous photograph from the campaign shows no angel. It shows a Papuan man, Rafael Ombari, holding the hand of a wounded, temporarily blinded Australian, Private George Whittington. Oembry gently leads him through the mud. Look at the photograph. Look at Oembry's eyes. They are not the eyes of a mythical creature. They are the eyes of a man who knows the jungle is suddenly quiet. Too quiet. A man who knows that in that silence his enemies are close. And he is listening. Listening for the single sharp crack of a twig that means he has to grab his charge and run for their lives. June 28th, 1944. A swamp in Dutch New Guinea. The swamp did not kill you quickly. It digested you. Slowly. It was a living stomach of mud and rot, and things that slithered in the black water. For 47 days, it had been digesting 3 Americans. Corporal Margaret Hastings, Sergeant Kenneth Decker, Lieutenant John McCollum. Their B-25 Mitchell bomber lay broken in the trees miles away, a forgotten metal corpse. A morale flight, that's what they called it. That's a pleasure trip over a valley so hidden, so isolated. Pilots had nicknamed it Shangri-La. A myth. Now the myth was their prison. The reports that came later were sterile, clinical. The folder was labeled Operation Shangri-La Rescue. It spoke of airdrops. It spoke of reconnaissance flights. It did not speak of the gnawing hunger, the infections, the constant buzzing fear. It did not speak of the Donny people who found them, villagers from a world untouched by steel or gasoline or war. Rumors among the airbases said they were cannibals, headhunters. The 3 survivors did not know. They only knew the painted faces that watched from the green shadows. They watched for days, silent, unmoving. Then they offered food. Survival was one thing, escape was another. The valley was a bowl with no exit, no trail out. The only way was the way the water flowed. Down, through miles of impassable swamp and treacherous rivers. A rescue team parachuted in, a Filipino-American commando, Captain C.M. Linder, Indonesian paratroopers, Australian intelligence men, brave men, determined men. But in the swamp, they were just as trapped. Their radios worked, their guns were clean, but they could not walk on water. They could not command the rivers. For that, they needed kings, the kings of the swamp. And they came. Not in warships, but in long, slender dugout canoes. Papuan boatmen, recruited from downriver villages by the Australians. Men whose names never made it into the official reports. They were just the natives. But they were the key, the only key. They knew the secret language of the currents, the hidden channels through the mangrove thickets. The places where the water was deep and the places where it would strand you. They were the difference. The difference between a grave in the mud and a ride home. The difference between life and death. The photographs show it. wounded soldiers lying in the bottom of canoes. Papuan men, their muscles coiled like ropes, paddling with a steady, relentless rhythm. Navigating a world that wanted to kill everyone in it. Navigating them out. That's how the legend of Shangri-La ended. Not with a bang, but with the quiet dip of a paddle in black water. Not all rescues were so grand, so epic. Sometimes it was just one man, one boy, one moment. 1943, near the Kumusi River in Papua. A medal is not made of metal, not really. It is forged in a single impossible second. The second you choose. The river was a brown, churning monster swollen with monsoon rains. It had swallowed a bridge, it had swallowed trees, and now it had swallowed 2 American soldiers. They were gone, pulled under by a force that did not care about the war or alliances or the lives of men. The current was chaos, a meat grinder of logs and debris. There was no hope. None. Then a schoolboy. Paul Maya. Just a boy. He saw it. He saw them go under. The other villagers on the bank shouted, they pointed, but they did not move. They knew the river. They knew its power. To go in was suicide. The boy, Paul Mia, he went in. He just went in. The official citation would later talk of bravery and loyalty to the Allied cause. Bureaucratic words, empty words. A boy on a riverbank does not think of causes. He sees a man drowning. He sees another man drowning, and he makes a choice. He fought the current. He fought the spinning logs. He fought the river itself. He reached the first soldier, somehow keeping his head above the raging water, and pushed him, pulled him, guided him toward the bank. Then he turned around. He went back into the monster. For the second man, the report stated he was nearly exhausted, nearly. But he got to the second man. He brought him back too. 2 lives. Plucked from a churning grave by a boy who should have been in a classroom. The Commonwealth awarded him the British Empire Medal. A Papuan schoolboy, a hero. The papers in London and Sydney and Washington printed his name. Paul Maya. Then they forgot. But the men who were there did not forget. They whispered the stories. Stories of the boatmen from the swamps of Dutch New Guinea. Stories of the schoolboy at the Kumusi River. Canoes, rowers, guides, carriers. Schneider, Becker, Wagner, Kaufmann, Kleine, Gross. Those were the names of dead German soldiers. The names of the Papuans were rarely written down. They were just the natives. Indispensable, vital, but nameless. They were the ghosts who saved the living. Their payment was a bag of salt or a few steel axe heads or sometimes just a nod of thanks. But the official records, the neat folders in archives in Canberra and Washington, they never mentioned the other price. The price of choosing a side, the price of loyalty. And in the villages along the rivers and deep in the jungle, that bill was coming due. May 13th, 1945, a hidden valley in Dutch New Guinea. They called it Shangri-La. It was a name born of pilot gossip and blurry aerial photographs. A perfect green bowl carved out of the island's stone spine, sealed off from the world. They said people there lived in a lost age. A stone age. The pilots on leave in Hollandia wanted to see it. Just a look. A sightseeing trip for the men and women who had seen too much war. The plane was a Douglas C-47 Skytrain, a workhorse. They called this one the Gremlin Special. On board were 24 souls, soldiers, nurses, whacks. They were flying low, banking over the jagged green canopy for a better view of the myth. A joyride over a place that did not give up its secrets easily. A fatal joyride. The clouds rolled in without warning, thick, white, absolute. Nobody saw the mountain. The report would later state controlled flight into terrain. A clinical term for a moment of pure chaos. Metal screaming, twisting, tearing. The sound of trees becoming splinters and bodies becoming broken things, then silence. A profound, ringing silence broken only by the drip of fuel on hot metal. Out of 24, 3 lived. Only 3. Lieutenant John McCollum, Sergeant Kenneth Decker, and Corporal Margaret Hastings of the Women's Army Corps. They crawled from the mangled fuselage, a collection of burns, broken bones, and shocks so deep it felt like a dream. McCollum's head was gashed, Decker's leg was shattered. Hastings was badly burned, her skin peeling away in sheets. They were alive in a place that wasn't on any map. They were not alone. For days they knew it. A feeling, a flicker of movement in the dense foliage. The snap of a twig that wasn't an animal. They had a pistol, a few rounds. Rumors from Hollandia replayed in their minds. Headhunters? Tribes that practiced ritual cannibalism. Stories whispered over warm beer, now terrifyingly real. The official folders on the region were thin. One document simply said unexplored. Unexplored. A word that meant anything was possible. And then they came. They emerged from the trees not like ghosts, but like the earth itself rising up. Men with painted faces, their skin glistening with pig grease. They carried long spears, stone axes. Their noses were pierced with boar tusks, their bodies adorned with shells and fur and feathers. The Dani, the Yali, names the survivors would only learn later. At that moment, they were just fear given form. The warriors circled the wreckage. They touched the torn aluminum skin of the gremlin special. They chattered in a language of clicks and guttural sounds, a language as old as the stones in the valley. They looked at the three Americans. They looked at their pale skin, their strange clothes, their injuries. They pointed. They whispered. They stared at Corporal Hastings. Margaret, a woman with hair the color of sun-dried grass. They had never seen anything like her. The men would approach cautiously and touch her blonde hair. Gently, a disbelieving caress. They would touch her skin, then look at their own hands. She was an apparition, a spirit. They brought her food first. Steamed sweet potatoes, strange vegetables wrapped in leaves. They did not offer violence, they offered sustenance. Days bled into weeks. A strange routine set in. The tribespeople, once a source of terror, became their keepers, their guardians. They built a shelter for the survivors. They brought food daily. A tribal elder, a man they called Pete, used poultices of leaves and mud on Hastings' burns. It was a complex interaction, a fragile truce between the 20th century and the Stone Age, brokered in a language of gestures and shared humanity. McCollum tried to keep a log. Decker fought off infection and agony. Hastings endured the constant, unnerving curiosity. She was a goddess, a spectacle, a patient. The sky was their only hope. One day a plane came, a tiny silver speck against the blue. It circled. It saw them. The survivors waved frantically, using a piece of the fuselage as a mirror. Hope, sharp and painful, surged through them. They were found. But the valley was a prison. A beautiful green prison with walls 3,000 feet high. A rescue report was filed at command. Survivors located in Balium Valley. Landing impossible, repeat, landing impossible. The valley that had protected them now held them captive. The world knew where they was, but the world could not reach them. So they sent in the paratroopers, not soldiers, medics. A Filipino-American unit, the 11th Airborne Angels. Men who jumped out of planes to save lives, not take them. A voice on the radio called them paradoctors. They floated down from a C-47, billowing chutes against the green. Sergeant Benjamin Bulatow, Corporal Camilo Rami, others. They brought morphine, sulfa powder, plasma, cigarettes, chocolate. They were a miracle falling from the sky. They set up a field hospital amid the stone axes and thatched huts. But they were still trapped, all of them. The final plan was audacious. It was insane. It was written up in a folder labeled Operation Glider Extraction. The idea was simple and terrifying. A C-47 would tow an empty CG-4A Waco glider into the valley. The glider pilot would cut loose, land on a perilously short, cleared strip of land, and pick up a survivor. Then the tow plane would come back. Low. Fast. It would snag the glider's tow rope off a pair of poles with a steel hook, yanking the glider and its passenger from a dead stop to 120 miles per hour in seconds. It had a high probability of failure. Catastrophic failure. The first to go was Sergeant Decker. They loaded him into the flimsy glider, a craft of canvas and steel tubes and wood. The tow plane, the San Antonio Rose that made its pass, missed the rope and had to circle around the massive valley for another attempt. Tension hung in the air, thick as the jungle humidity. The tribes watched, silent, waiting. The C-47 came again, roaring low over the treetops. This time, the hook caught. There was a sound like the sky ripping apart. A violent, sickening lurch. The tow rope snapped taut, and the glider was snatched from the earth. It shot forward, bounced once, then clawed its way into the air, a fragile kite being dragged to safety by an iron brute. How does history weigh a human soul? Not in the cold calculus of victories or the neat columns of casualty reports, but in the silent, desperate moments that defy all ledgers. It is measured in the space between a last breath and a first helping hand, a space where official records fall silent and a deeper truth begins to stir. The ink of history is thin, the mud and blood of memory run deep. The archives speak of a war fought in 1942, a brutal campaign for strategic points along a forgotten coastline. They detail the movements of battalions, the impact of artillery, the grand strategies drawn on maps thousands of miles away. But those maps show no trace of a 19-year-old gunner from Scranton, listening to his own heart pound against the jungle floor, his shattered femur a white-hot spike of agony. They do not capture the sound of the approaching Japanese patrol, the rustle of leaves that meant death. And they certainly do not explain the sudden appearance of shadows, dark hands gently lifting him, cradling his broken body as if he were their own child. Why? No order was given. No reward was offered. The official reports mention a downed aircraft, a B-17 Flying Fortress swallowed by the canopy. They list the crew as missing, presumed lost. They cannot convey the scent of aviation fuel and burning wire, the disorienting shock of crawling from a mangled fuselage into a world of smothering green. They do not describe the faces that appeared through the smoke, not with guns, but with water and vine-strong arms. Faces that saw not an enemy soldier, not a foreign uniform, but simply a man, burned and broken. They carried them for days, a human stretcher train moving with a speed that defied logic, a green wave of men perfectly suited to the green hell they were conquering, one life at a time. They pushed them, pulled them, guided them across raging rivers that should have claimed them all. An act of impossible grace repeated again and again. The truth remained somewhere between the lines, between the fading ink of government files, between the silence of the saved and the silence of the saviors. This was a war fought within a war, a conflict invisible to the generals and the politicians. It was a story told not by flags but by hands, a history written not by treaties but by feet treading paths no map would ever show. They came as warriors, masters of technology and firepower, men of steel and engine. They were met by men of sinew and spirit, masters of a world that fought back with every vine, every insect, every endless downpour. The invaders became the helpless. The so-called primitives became the epitome of grace. Strangers became saviors. The hunted became the guides. There was no grand strategy here, no ideology. There was only the raw, undeniable fact of one human being choosing to save another at immense personal risk. It was a currency of compassion traded in the heart of chaos, an economy of empathy that thrived where civilization had failed. They were called the fuzzy-wuzzy angels in condescending rhymes, a nickname that belittled the profound nature of their sacrifice. They were not angels, they were men. And that is the more staggering miracle. They were men who possessed a wealth the invaders could not comprehend, not material abundance, an abundance of spirit, an abundance of humanity. We search for monuments to these forgotten heroes, for official recognition and medals never cast. We comb through declassified documents for a footnote, a mention, a name. But perhaps their monument was never meant to be stone or bronze. Perhaps it is the jungle itself, a living memorial, vast and impenetrable, its canopy a vaulted ceiling holding its secrets close. Its roots run deeper than any archive, preserving the memory of every footprint, every hushed word, every drop of sweat and blood. It remembers the weight of the wounded. It remembers the silent, rhythmic steps of their carriers. It remembers everything we chose to forget. And in the deep green, where the past never truly dies and the ghosts of 3 wars still walk, one question hangs heavy in the humid air, refusing to dissolve. In that crucible of mud and fear, who was truly carrying whom?